electricians. In the campaign before that, the 1999 grad stop campaign, affiliated with the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. And there's so many acronyms here in union organizing that I just did this. So that's what that's about. Okay. A foreground affiliation here because the focus of my talk today is one of the models we use to organize, one of the many. We organize using the model of the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, from 2007 to 2010. In 2010, after some shopping around, we contracted with the UAW to represent us. And from then on, we used more or less their model, with some IWW members still at work within the campaign using the IWW model to some extent. I served on the core committee for 3 years under the previous model, the IWW model, and I organize under that model today with my current campaign, University Workers United. So in September 2007, I was a third-year graduate writing instructor in the English department's PhD program at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Just as was the case in the graduate work campaign before us, our campaign began on the picket lines of a strike. It was our local AFSCME, which is the Union of Technical, Clerical, and Medical Workers. They had their second unsuccessful strike in 5 years. In response to the strike, some of us formed the Experimental College to give an alternative space for university workers to give and take free classes without crossing picket lines on organizing during the strike. Some of us organized a series of conferences designed to connect organizers in the academy against neoliberalization. Some of us dove into organizing a graduate workers union, and I took a break from my dissertation to do all three. Given a long string of graduate unionization defeats in our wake, we knew it was important to start our organizing campaign by looking at the postmortems of the previous campaigns. The organizers of the 2004 GradTrack United Electricians campaign surmised that they lost for 4 main reasons: the university's aggressive union busting campaign, the impossibly broad composition of the bargaining unit, the relatively small size of the core organizing committee. All sounds familiar, right? And the thing I'm here to talk to you about today, the organizing model. Here was our reaction to each of these cautions. The union busting law firm. The university's intense and sophisticated anti-union efforts had a lot to do with labor law, actually, since this anti-union campaign was allowed to gather steam during the NLRA's mandatory 80-day waiting period. You see, after getting the majority of the workplace to sign cards and before the election, the National Labor Relations Act requires you to have a cooling off period of 80 days. This is the time when the big union busters are called in and the most vulnerable time for the campaign. Now, we knew this was an impediment, but if there's anything harder than organizing a union nowadays, it's changing labor law. So we knew there was nothing we could do about the vulnerability every campaign faces in that 80-day period when it's perfectly legal under Taft-Hartley 1947 for employees to hire union busting lawyers and get to work on all those people who you got to sign union cards. Although we agreed wholeheartedly on the difficulty of organizing given this obstacle, we knew that this was the reality we had to face. The second reason the postmortem identified as the reason for the election loss was the composition of the bargaining unit, which was far too broad. PELRA, which is the Public Employee Labor Act, which is what's applicable at a private university as opposed to NLRA, based our bargaining unit on job classification, not on job description. So our bargaining unit was both RAs and TAs, both pre-med and business professional school workers on the one hand, PhDs on the other, grad workers in the sciences, grad workers in the humanities. It was all grouped together in one bargaining unit, despite the fact that we have really different demands. To appeal to both groups at once when their stakes in unionization are so different is extremely difficult to do, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, and I believe that this is the subject of, to somewhat Molly's talk today. One group has majority international students whose main threat is losing their visas. One group is paid half as much as the other group. The two groups perform completely different work, have different workloads, different rates of sexual harassment, and have completely different relationships with their faculty advisors. So they have radically different workplace issues, and organizing people with such disparate workplace issues is an added challenge. Alternatives to this type of bargaining unit that might have favored labor organizing include having TAs in the same bargaining unit as other instructor staff like adjuncts, tenure track, and tenure cross, excluding RAs and fellowship students, for example. So as for this item on the postmortem, we had the same reaction to it as the previously mentioned one, which is about the legality of union busting. Although we agreed wholeheartedly that labor law was not in our favor, we didn't have the time or resources. You can even imagine the time or resources to change a bargaining unit and start a campaign, right? So we had to dive into this campaign, no matter what the size of the bargaining unit was. We knew going in that the labor law wasn't on our side, but we had to organize anyway. But this is not the case with the last 2 points on the postmortem, the size of the core committee and strategy. The people in both campaigns, the current one, the one we were previous in, knew that it did have control over the size of the core committee, and it did have control over organizing strategy. So we wouldn't need to change labor law in order to improve on these 2 fronts. So first, we worked on the size of our core committee. The core committee was about a dozen people in the campaign before ours. That's far too small, I think we'd all agree, for a bargaining unit of 4,440 grad workers. Just to give a benchmark, the model I organize with now, the IWW, recommends having 10% of your bargaining unit on your core committee. At the U of M, Minnesota, that would mean having a core committee of 440 people. So you might ask, how's that a core? There's too many people to have a core, but if you consider the dozens of schools and the hundreds of, like 100 departments within those schools that need to be represented, it's a fair number. So about this item on the postmortem, we were like, okay, our campaign, the GSWU, the Graduate Student Workers United, the 2012 campaign, knew we didn't want to organize that size of bargaining unit with only a dozen core organizers, but we actually didn't do much better between 2007 and 2010 when I was involved. We had between 25 and 35 organizers when we had volunteer organizers. So it was the next point on strategy where we had decidedly different stance in theory and in practice, the IWW model. Now, United Electricians has a grassroots, democratic, non-hierarchical organizing strategy based on one-on-one conversations, much like the TAA, of which Michael is a part, and an AFT. United Electricians had just won the University of Iowa the year before, so the UE had experience winning for grad workers at public institutions like ours. So why didn't this organizing strategy work for us in the 2012 election? The postmortem made this intriguing observation that the UE model didn't exploit academic culture enough. The hubris of the organizing strategy, according to the report, was indeed its center, all the one-on-one conversations that didn't, quote, exploit the academic model of discussion, debate, research, and response, unquote. That is, the organizing strategy wasn't plugged in enough to the culture of our workplace, and it would have been, quote, more effective to approach the question of unionization as a multi-tiered intellectual debate plus political engagement rather than a one-tiered debate plus propaganda. So the IWW model, the people who started the next campaign, the one which I was involved in, were Wobblies, members of the IWW. The IWW was formed at the turn of the century. It is an anarchist union that has about 5,000 members worldwide. Its international headquarters is here in Chicago. Our campaign began as a dozen people who got trained for 2 days in the IWW model, intensive, like 48-hour training, and grew to about 30 people on the core committee. And we went to the IWW for 2 reasons. It offered solidarity unionism and industrial unionism, a model that embraces many parts of academic culture. So I just want to talk for a minute about what solidarity unionism today, because it's so much a part of the direct action that has been referenced a lot today. I think of solidarity unionism as a way to get around labor law. The IWW recognizes that U.S. labor law was created for the bosses, not for the workers. Labor law is, in fact, the main obstacle to labor organizing. It's great that we have labor law in the U.S., but our labor law sucks, and it works against us. The main obstacles are the prescribed composition of the bargaining unit and the prescribed way elections are to be held, the 2 things I already mentioned. The IWW mostly rejects NLRB elections altogether for the following reasons, as put by Mike Pudd'nhead, IWW organizer Jimmy Johns, in his book Wages So Low You'll Freak. Good title. Quote, more than half of all recognition campaigns never come to a vote. Either the union never gains enough support to petition for an election, or they withdraw their petition before the election because of the brutal anti-union campaign. Of these election recognition campaigns where an election is actually held, more than half of them never agree on a first contract. The only thing union recognition guarantees is that a union can legally bargain with an employer on behalf of its members. It doesn't force the company to agree. Taking a liberal estimate of a 3% success rate of elections to the first contract, that contract still has limited duration, after which you must negotiate a second contract. The company can even push a decertification petition, and at the end of the day, it's a wonder collective bargaining agreements exist at all, unquote. The IWW recognizes that labor law was created for and benefits bosses, not workers. And one way the IWW gets around labor law is to avoid elections altogether. They are kind of what is called contract unionism. Contract unionism is when the goal or endpoint or telos of organizing is to get a contract that formalizes the negotiations between you and your employer. The IWW model is an alternative to contract unionism, solidarity unionism. Solidarity unionism is not about having an endpoint at all. It's about, except for the individual demands along your scaffolding of escalating action. The union is a collection of workers who have the power of a union, not through a contract, but through continuous direct action. That is the thing that makes the union a union, not a contract, but continuous actions that build worker power. One loophole of U.S. labor law is the IWW exploits is this one, that the law protects us in numbers. So if I go to complain about the printer constantly being low on toner or something, and I go alone, the boss can legally fire me. But if Michael and I go together, it's not legal to fire us both. So there is actually that little tiny bit of labor law that we can use as a loophole. We can declare ourselves a union right now in this room. So when Laura called for that we have a direct action out of this conference, we can declare ourselves a union right now. But what makes our employers recognize us as a union? It's continuous job actions, which build our power and make them recognize us as a union. Our power is held together through solidarity, not a contract. So Trish gave an example earlier of, in an earlier panel, of Chicago teachers doing a wildcat strike, and that's a strike that's not authorized by the union. So that's an example of not coming to school. The demand of not coming to school on cold days wasn't in their contract, but they struck on it anyway. And so that's an example of sort of like demands that fall outside of a contract that you can still strike around. Okay. So that is why the IWW is called a union of organizers, because our very existence depends on actions we wage. Everyone in that union has got to be as good as any paid organizer that would be flown in from a big business union to help you win. Every one of us has to be a great organizer, and a great organizer not just before any election, but because there is no election, we have to be great organizers all the time. And in 2007, we wanted a union of organizers, not a union represented by organizers, so that we could devise a campaign strategy according to our workplace culture. Laura talked earlier on her panel about how effective direct action is, like, for example, in the living wage campaign. So you can build a union that way. Okay, the second and last reason that I'll talk about today is why we went with the IWW in the first years is because it advocates industrial unionism, which I think suits academic culture well. Industrial unionism isn't about manufacturing. It just means that you organize every job class in an entire institution. And in the case of the project I'm working on, in the citywide adjunct and faculty, grad workers, staff, and undergrad workers organize across the job classes. This is opposed to craft unionism, where you organize the faculty in one union and the staff in another. Industrial unionism means we cannot organize grad workers without organizing undergrads. So there should be ideally several unions forming simultaneously, all in solidarity with one another. I think this suits academic culture because we're an institution of education. In many ways, we can educate each other about our work conditions. For example, many grad instructors used their role as educators to teach our undergrads in the classes we taught about the direct actions by grad workers that our undergrads saw happening in Like our first campaign was a student fees campaign. And simultaneously in class, undergrads can radicalize us on what their issue for is unpaid workers in the university structure or as workers outside of the university. So the main advantages in my mind of the IWW model are getting around labor law through solidarity unionism and the ability to tweak the model to academic culture through the IWW's industrial model. So this model has a big hazard that I think all models do, and that's burnout. Because you have to be an organizer all the time, and your worker power depends completely on direct action. None of us understood at the time that never quit organizing didn't mean each individual organizer needn't take a step back and take a break, but it is essential to stop organizing before burnout and never go past burnout, or the organizer will never come back, right? Because you guys know. But we didn't get that. Therefore, burnout was prevalent. We wanted relief. So we wanted to fly in paid organizers to do the job for us because we were exhausted. So in 2010, the core committee voted to find a collective bargaining agent. It was between AFT and the UAW, and we chose UAW because they win 98% of their elections, they said at the time, and they're one of the top 3 biggest and busiest affiliates in higher ed. And if they chose you to represent, it looked like you were going to win. And they had me at $800 million strike fund release. They had many of my colleagues. Nevertheless, despite the UAW's 98% success rate, we did lose by a landslide, a far larger margin, and did the campaign before us that organized with the United Electricians. Thank you. It is important to emphasize here that you don't necessarily have to choose models. The IWW model can definitely coexist, and most often coexist with other unions. I know of locals in the Communication Workers Association, SEIU, and UAW that have active lobbies constantly trying to move their contract unionism to the left and make the UAW local into a union of organizers. They do things like organized strikes and other job actions the larger business union didn't approve of, the Wildcat strikes. That said, Wobblies I know who took this path encountered some problems. The UAW held all the records. The paid organizers of the UAW made all the strategy decisions. So there's an extent to which coexistence of the 2 models can only go so far.